Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of English Grammar with Max. Today, we want to talk about third conditional and mixed conditional. In the previous video, we talked about zero conditional, first conditional, and second conditional. So if you want to practice or if you want to learn the other conditionals, zero, first, and second, I recommend you go and watch our previous video. Let's begin with third conditional and mixed conditional. Okay, let's start with third conditional. We use third conditional to describe an imaginary situation in the past. If you have already studied second conditional, you know that we use second conditional also to talk about an imaginary situation. But what is the difference between second conditional and third conditional? In the second conditional, we are talking about an imaginary situation in the present or in the future. For example, we say, if I were rich, I would buy that house. Or, if I were 10 years younger, I would do something else. For example, we are talking about now. We are not talking about the past. Yes, with the second conditional, in the condition phrase, we do use past simple. But we call it fake past, because we use past simple, but we are actually talking about present or future. Now, third conditional is an imaginary situation in the past. It means something happened and finished. Now we are assuming that if things had gone differently. Example, we say, if you had arrived earlier, you would have seen her. This is the if clause, and this is the consequence. We call it condition or if clause, and this one the consequence. The tense of the if clause in a third conditional is past perfect. And the tense or the form of the consequence is would have plus past participle of the main verb of your sentence. And remember, we always need to use a comma in here if you are using if in the beginning of the sentence. But if you use if, or if you bring the condition second, it means if is in the middle of the sentence, you don't need to use a comma. All right, now we say if you had arrived earlier. Let's talk about the meaning of this sentence. When we say if you had arrived earlier, it means we are talking about the past, and besides, that person didn't arrive early enough. That is why we call it an imaginary situation in the past, because it didn't happen. If you had arrived earlier, an imaginary situation or an imaginary condition in the past, you would have seen her. Would have, we always have in the third conditional in the consequence, plus the past participle of the main verb. So see, saw, seen her. Now, another example. In this example, we have brought the consequence first. This is the consequence, and this is the condition or the if clause. Okay, we say you wouldn't, again, this is a negative form. You wouldn't have got, the past participle form of get is got and gotten. Both of them are accepted. You wouldn't have got lost if you'd, this is the contracted form for had. If you'd or you had asked for directions. It means that person got lost because that person didn't ask for directions. That is why we are assuming if he had asked for directions, he wouldn't have got lost. Okay, one point about the third conditional. We can use could and might instead of would with a change of meaning, of course. Remember, we could also use could and might in the second conditional instead of would. But remember, there is always a change of meaning. Example. We say, if she'd listened to me, the condition, past perfect, it means she didn't listen to me. That is why this is an imaginary situation. She would have become more successful. When you use would in a second conditional or in a third conditional, this expresses certainty. This expresses certainty. So when you use, for example, if I were richer, second conditional, I would buy that house, it means I would definitely do that. It is certain in your mind. But when you use could or might, and remember, could and might, in this particular context, mean the same. When you use could and might, example, we say, if she had listened to me, she could have become more successful, or she might have become more successful. In here, we are not expressing certainty anymore. We are expressing probability. So, probability. So yes, we could use could and might instead of would in the second conditional and in the third conditional, but with a change in meaning. Okay, last point before we get to the exercises, I want to talk about mixed conditionals. Mixed conditionals are generally a mix of second and third conditional. Remember, sometimes the condition phrase or the if clause could be from the second conditional and the consequence from the third conditional, and sometimes the opposite. Let me give you two examples for each case. If I were a doctor, this is your if clause, this is your condition, and apparently this is a second conditional because this is in past simple, or as we call it in conditionals, this is a fake past. If I were a doctor, it means I am not a doctor. Let's read on. It says, I would have helped him. This belongs to the third conditional. So this belongs to the second conditional because we are generally stating an assumption, an imaginary assumption, because I'm not a doctor. If I were a doctor, but in the consequence, we had a situation in the past. I would have helped him. It means someone needed help at some time in the past, and I would have helped him or helped her, but I'm not a doctor. So if I were a doctor, generally, I would have helped him in that particular situation in the past. Now we can do the opposite as well. If I'd taken your advice, in here, as you can see, this is your if clause, and this is in past perfect. This is in past perfect. So this belongs to the third conditional. This is from second. This is from third. So we assume that because this is in past perfect, that the consequence should be with would have plus past participle. But let's see, it says I wouldn't be in trouble. It means I wouldn't be in trouble now. So this is would plus the base form belongs to the second conditional. So again, sometimes we are making a general assumption, a general imaginary assumption in the condition clause, and then the consequence is about the past. This is one form of mixed conditional. Another form, sometimes there is an imaginary situation in the past with using past perfect in the condition clause. If I taken your advice, it means I didn't take your advice. That is why this is an imaginary situation in the past. But it has present results. We say, I wouldn't be in trouble now. Or for example, another example we could say, he wouldn't be in prison now if he hadn't committed that crime. So an imaginary situation in the past with a consequence or consequences in the present. Okay, let's take a look at some exercises. These exercises are from the book Intermediate Language Practice. Let's begin. Okay, let's start with the exercises. Rewrite each comment beginning as shown. Do not change the meaning. Let's start. A. Supposing you had wings, what would you do? Remember, if is not the only option for us as the condition word. We could use other condition words like assuming, providing, provided, as long as, when, and so on. In here we are using supposing. Supposing you had wings, what would you do? So the answer is, what would you do if you had wings? This is a second conditional, obviously an imaginary situation, because we don't have wings. B. Why don't you leave now? That's what I'd do. This is a form of advice. So we could use, if I were you, I'd leave now. And I have told you that we could use this form of second conditional to give advice. C. Imagine you lived on Mars. How would you feel? This is again obviously a second conditional case because it is a completely imaginary situation. We say, how would you feel if you lived on Mars? D. I think you should buy a bike. That's what I'd do. Again, we're giving a piece of advice, so we could use the second conditional form. If I were you, I'd buy a bike. E. Imagine you were rich. What would you do? This is again obviously an imaginary situation. Imagine is something else we could use as condition word. What would you do if you were rich? F. Supposing Jim came with us, what would you say? Again, an imaginary situation, and this is another way of saying it. What would you say if Jim came with us? G. Why don't you take the bus? That's what I do. Again, we are giving a piece of advice, so we could use this form of second conditional. If I were you, I'd take the bus. H. Imagine you owned a robot. What would you do? Again, an imaginary situation. What would you do if you owned a robot? And remember, I told you that if you bring the condition clause second, it means after the consequence, you don't need to use a comma. Next exercise. Underline the correct word or phrase in each sentence. A. If you phoned or had phoned me yesterday, this is obviously talking about an imaginary situation in the past. So this must be third conditional. If you had phoned me yesterday, again, I would have given you the news. B. If you took or if you would have taken. Look, in the condition clause, we don't use would or would have. Would have is for the consequence. So this is obviously took. And we could conclude that because we're using a past simple form in the condition, this is a second conditional, so you might feel better. And I told you that in the second conditional, we could use might and could instead of would to express probability and not certainty. C. If Tim drove or had driven more carefully, so we are apparently talking about some incident in the past, and we are describing an imaginary situation, so this is obviously a third conditional. If Tim had driven more carefully, he wouldn't have crashed. D. If you had come or if you came to see the film, again, this is apparently talking about an imaginary situation in the past, so third conditional. If you had come, past perfect, you would have enjoyed it. E. If I'd known, if I would know, again, we don't use would or would have in the condition clause. So we need to choose I'd known. This is in past perfect, so we could tell that this is a third conditional. I would have sent you a card. Be careful, sometimes it is a mixed conditional. You need to see if it is describing a consequence in the present or in the past. This is in the past, so this is a pure third conditional. F. If people had helped or helped one another more often. This is obviously like a criticism leveled against the society, so this is an imaginary situation in the present, so past simple. Second conditional. The world might be a better place. Again, because we are expressing probability, not certainty, we use might instead of would. G. If our team had scored or scored more goals, this is apparently talking about a situation in the past, an imaginary situation, and apparently the team has lost. So, if our team had scored past perfect more goals, we could have won. Again, we use could because we are trying to express probability. It means I'm not sure if our team would have won, but it could have won. H. If you, again, would have, we don't use would have in the condition clause, so the answer is if you wore a coat. This is in past simple, so we could tell this is a second conditional. You wouldn't get wet. Next exercise. Complete the sentence for each situation. A. Again, I recommend you could pause the video, write the answers, then we could check them together. A. Charlotte didn't leave early, so she missed the bus. We are talking about an imaginary situation in the past. So we use third conditional. If Charlotte had left early, past perfect, she wouldn't have missed the bus. B. I didn't buy more milk, so I didn't have enough for breakfast. Again, a situation in the past, obviously a third conditional. If I had bought or if I'd bought more milk, the contracted form, I would have, or you could use the contracted form, would have. I would have had enough for breakfast. Because your main verb is have. We use the past participle of the main verb, which is had. C. We forgot to take a map, so we got lost in the mountains. Again, a situation in the past, so third conditional. If we'd taken a map, past perfect, we wouldn't have got lost in the mountains. Again, got is the past participle form of get. Got and gotten are both accepted. D. I didn't go to bed early, so I didn't wake up at 7. Again, a third conditional, because we are talking about the past. If I'd gone to bed early, I would have woken up at 7. E. Mike didn't make a shopping list, and he forgot to buy some coffee. Again, we are talking about the past, so definitely a third conditional. If Mike had made a shopping list, past perfect, he wouldn't have forgotten to buy some milk. F. I didn't realize you were tired when I asked you to go for a walk. Again, we are talking about the past, so definitely third conditional. G. The Romans didn't sail across the Atlantic, so they didn't reach America. Let's assume an imaginary situation in the past, so third conditional. If the Romans had sailed across the Atlantic, they would have or would have reached America. H. I didn't turn left at this station and I lost my way. If I had turned left at the station, I wouldn't have lost my way. Alright guys, thank you for watching another English Grammar with Max. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like our videos and subscribe to our channel. And if you liked the videos, if you found them useful, don't forget to recommend them to your friends. See you next time.